on the day I submit my letter of resignation. And I say, I can't work here anymore. And I write a big, long email about, hey, guys, I know production's king and all that stuff, but someone's going to die here. And I basically said what I said here, this long dissertation. And I said, I am imploring you to stop, think, assess risks. Someone's going to die. When I worked at Nucor Steel, we were telling this story. I was fortunate to have my first job be with a company called Cargill. Cargill is the largest privately owned company, I think, in the world, definitely in the United States, but I think in the world. And I started at Cargill. You guys all know my story. I worked in a salt mine in Cargill. And one of the things that was ingrained in you working in a mine and working at Cargill specifically, Cargill is notoriously serious about safety, and they mean it. They're not bullshitting. My very first job in industry was at Cargill, where safety was absolutely job number one. The reason it was job number one is because it's good business, but also because Cargill was a family-owned company. They own lots of dangerous industries. They don't want people dying. I mean, there's no reason for people to die at work, okay? And at Cargill, it was very, very serious. Cargill, safety was number one. You basically got fired for two reasons at Cargill. Number one, absenteeism. So they had this AWOL system. If you got 6 AWOLs and you were a minute late when you had 6 AWOLs, you're gone. There was zero tolerance. It didn't matter who you were gone. And the second reason, safety. You get caught working on a belt, no lockout, tag out, you get, above 5 feet without being tied off. I'm telling you, it was literally zero tolerance. Like, safety was absolutely job number one, and it's everyone's responsibility. And I was a member of behavioral sciences technology, Sharks team, it's called Sharks. And where basically you observe people work and you give them feedback on how they can do their job safely. Right. And, everyone knows my story. I was at Cargill. Safety was absolutely job number one. And then, we went years and years and years without a lost time accident. And while some of the books were cooked, like people kind of got dinged and stuff and never reported it, but there was never a major injury or anything that they slid under the rug. Right. So I left Cargill and I went into printing, and that was a privately owned company, and safety was just fucking ignored. I mean, you literally could do high risk behaviors all the time. There's within industry or within behavioral sciences, there's a concept called Heinrich's accident triangle, which basically says that you have to you can basically work back from fatalities, determine the number of at-risk behaviors that had to happen in order for someone to die. So you got to have you're on mute, Zach.
It's kind of like a sales funnel or something.
Exact same concept. You got to have a certain number of at-risk behaviors to get one first aid. You got to have a certain number of first aids to have a near miss. You have to have a certain number of near misses to have a lost time accident, and you need to have a certain number of lost time accidents to have a fatality, right? And so then I left that printing company and I went and I worked for Nucor Steel. One of the, in my opinion, Dan D'Amico was the CEO there at the time. Nucor Steel, I was talking about this in mentorship this morning, is one of the greatest companies in the United States, one of the best companies to work for, phenomenal place to be, amazing people. And I made shit ton of money. In fact, the way that our compensation structure is based on the Nucor model. I talk about it all the time. During the downturn, they didn't lay anybody off. They invested money in infrastructure and, just crushed the market when they came out of the downturn after the Great Recession. But one thing that Nucor Steel wasn't good at in the facility I worked at was safety. They were terrible. And Vaughn and I were talking about this. He was in upstate. I worked in a mill in upstate New York, and he ran into a couple of guys at a bar and, what are you doing here? Blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh, I work for this company. Oh, you work for Walker Reynolds. I go, oh, we know that guy. That guy, he's the guy who wrote the email at Nucor Steel. So here's the story of the email. So when I went to Nucor Steel, I worked in the electrical department. So I was in the electrical group. I worked in the rolling mill. And one of the first things that stood out to me when I was at Nucor was just how unsafe things were. I mean, not only is working in a steel mill dangerous, but people there were fucking reckless. I mean, just absolutely. I could not believe that we didn't have dead bodies everywhere. Seriously, I saw things happen and I can't remember how long I was there. I think maybe like 4 or 5 months before I'm like, man, this is really modus operandi. This is normal shit. and I may have been there a year by the time I wrote this email. I can't remember how long it was, but I finally just, I mean, I used to see crazy shit. So, we had a shutdown day every Wednesday for one shift, and guys would climb up I would see people up on cranes with no harnesses, not tying off. We're talking cranes over the scrapyard. I would see people working on three-phase 4160 motors that drove rolling mill stands that were not locked out. I mean, like literally, they push the button to pop the vacuum breaker. They wouldn't lock it out. They'd walk all the way down to the MCC, at the end of the MCC, to work on the stand. Nothing. I saw NFPA 70E, which is the arc flash standard. There was literally no NFPA 70E standard within the organization. Yeah, I mean, it was insane. It was pure insanity. I mean, I would see the types of things every day. I would see 20, 30, 40 examples of behaviors that would have gotten you fired immediately working at Cargill in the mine. I mean, immediately. And at Nucor, it was just normal. It was normal behavior. And this wasn't a Nucor corporate thing. What I ended up learning was that Nucor had acquired this mill a few years earlier. And that mill used to be like a mom and pop mill. And all the guys that were still there, they operated the way they used to operate. And this mill was incredibly profitable. So I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I saw two guys up on a crane, and I told my wife, I'm like, somebody's going to die here, and there's nothing I'm going to be able to do about it. I mean, I was an EMT, for a volunteer EMT, and like, I'm a guy who runs into the fire when people are running away, and I just couldn't stay there and have people die. And I would speak up. I mean, don't get me wrong. And I was not popular. There were people that pissed off at me all the time, like, cause I'm rocking the boat talking about people's safety and shit. So I submit my letter of resignation to my operations manager, not my supervisor, but the guy above him. And I send an all employees email on the day I submit my letter of resignation. And I say, I can't work here anymore. And I write a big long email about, hey guys, I know production's king and all that stuff, but someone's going to die here. I basically said what I said here, this long dissertation. And I said, I am imploring you to stop, think, assess risks. Someone's going to die. Okay. Well, it nearly happened about 5 days later while I was on my 2 weeks. My 2 weeks after I gave my notice, we were on a shutdown and a guy was on a snorkel. He was actually on a scissor lift, and he was helping. They were cutting a piece of like 1-inch steel. I think it was 4 feet by 4 feet, 1-inch steel. And he was trying, and they were cutting it and re-welding it onto, this was over in the melt shop. And the guy stuck his head between the two rails to like hold the steel, which is a no-no. You're never supposed to reach outside of the basket. That's like it's a rule in high work. And the guy who was controlling the snorkel, he said, "Oh, I need you to move down, bring it down." And he put the handle in the wrong direction, and he went up and nearly lopped this guy's head right off. Okay, now fortunately he lived. Okay, he lived, but it was a major accident. Okay, well,
So the writing was on the wall. Like people
writing
were like,
this
I
guy
told you.
nearly died. He went to the hospital. I mean, it could he was a centimeter from having his fucking head taken right off. So to Nucor's credit, when that happened, and I can't remember all the details what happened, but basically they called me in. The new mine manager, they brought her name was Mary Emily Slate, and I'm giving her a shout out here. One of the absolute greatest leaders I've ever worked for in my entire career. She and a guy named Joe Rolfe from Cargill are two of my. They've had two of the biggest impacts on me in my entire career. Mary Emily Slate called me in and she said, I don't want you to leave the company. In fact, I want you to stay, and I want you to make a difference. I want you to change the way things happen here and a way things going on. And I said, what do you have in mind? She said, I want you to become like a safety officer. It'll be like a 6-month appointment. I'm going to have you and another guy be in this role, and you're going to report directly to me, to the mine manager. And I said, okay, sounds good. I'll do it. And I rescinded my resignation, and I did the job for 6 months. I learned real quick that safety is driven by leadership. Okay, safety is not something that happens from the ground up. That attitude is set at the leadership level. And it became very clear early on that all of the managers and supervisors that were there were the problem. Not that they were bad people, but their philosophy was production first, fuck safety. Okay. And a lot of people underestimated her, Mary Emily. I didn't. In fact, I told people, I said, she was like from Alabama or something, Southern Belle, incredibly smart, very, wicked, wicked, wicked smart. And she had elevated to, this is what I said to people. I said, this is a woman from Alabama in a man's, steel is very much a man's industry. And she has elevated to the level that she's in a fucking steel industry. And you want to underestimate her? I said, what that tells me is the reason she's always the smartest person in the room, and she has the added advantage of everyone underestimating her. That's what it told me, was like, and sure enough, over the 6 months, she kept her word. She was dead serious. Safety was the number one priority. She shut down the facility for like 5 days. Okay. Nothing. She shut down the facility. We didn't do any work. And by the way, half our pay was from
So
production.
people were kind of pissed, huh?
And we did nothing but safety related meetings and everything. She was dead ass serious about this. And let me say this. Over the course of that 6 months, I think she fired half the management. She demoted another third. And after I left, at the end of that position, I ended up leaving Nucor Steel and taking a position in automotive. So the end of my career at Nucor was this role.
So the legacy of Walker Reynolds and this letter, is it a legacy of like positive change, or is it a legacy
absolutely
of...
and what it is it's an example of, I took the moral position. It was not popular. People were pissed off. Even to this day, I'm sure people are pissed off that I did that. But at the end of the day, it affected the change that needed to happen in that organization. And let me say this, had Mary Emily Slate not been the leader there, it may not have happened. And to this day, and I think she runs a mill like in Louisiana or Mississippi now or something. But I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of leaders, and the two that have stood out to me throughout my entire career is this guy named Joe Rolfe, was the one who originally got me into this industry. He was my supervisor in the maintenance department, and I think he eventually became superintendent or something. Outstanding leader. He was the one who taught me that managers need to manage to people's strengths, that it's the manager's job to figure out what motivates each of the individual people. That's what I learned from him. And from Mary Emily Slate, what I learned was that real leaders, the buck stops with them. Mary Emily Slate was the one who accepted full responsibility for the state of the facility, and then she did something about it. Can't remember she was in charge of the whole facility. She was but I don't remember what the actual title was. It wasn't plant manager. It was GM of the facility. I mean, she was a big deal. She was important. If you work in I've seen in my career, I'll bet you, if you talk to the people that I've worked with in my career before I became an executive and owned all these companies, and I'll bet you, if you talk to them, none of them are surprised that I am where I'm at right now. I guarantee you, none of them are surprised. They may not all be happy about it, but none of them are surprised. Okay. The guys I worked with at Cargill who gave me a heart, they used to pick on me, pretty boy and college boy and all this crap, because I didn't look like a working class guy, you know what I mean? But I was a working class guy. And I always wore gloves, and I didn't want to get calluses on my hands. I was like, they're not surprised when it comes to safety. There was a guy who ended up getting killed at the Cargill mine. It was a contractor. A bin collapsed and killed a truck driver. And, there was a bunch of people who wrote letters into that local paper in upstate New York about, how dangerous it is there, and they need to shut the mine down. And I actually responded, and I said, listen, I haven't been at Cargill in 15 years. I have friends who work there, guys that I served with on the mine rescue team. And I fucking assure you that you couldn't possibly work at a safer place than Cargill. I mean, I'm telling you, safety is ingrained in that organization, top to bottom. I mean, and they're not paying me to say that. That was just the God honest truth. And when I went to Nucor Steel, it was the exact opposite at that facility in Auburn. When I went and visited other facilities, I've never seen a company that took safety as seriously as Cargill did, ever in my career. And so for those Cargill executives out there who don't even know that I ever worked in a Cargill facility, I'm on the back end of my career now. I started my career at Cargill. That has still stood with me. That's the gold standard. And Cargill's safety attitude is the attitude by which I compare all other organizations. I mean, all other organizations. And but what I will say is, if you're the employee that, you know, you see something, you know, it is
Quit your job and write an email, or
yeah. Well, I mean, I always had a different. I used to tell people all the time. I started saving 10% of everything I made once I started turning 19, because my dad told me you don't have freedom until you have financial freedom. There's no such thing as freedom. Some people call it like fuck you money or whatever, right? I have that. I mean, money never comes into my calculation. I had the advantage when I was at Nucor Steel that I was there for a reason, and I had the advantage of saying I can quit this job and I'm still going to be able to pay my mortgage and all those things. I've had that attitude my whole career. I believe that that is the best way for you to be able to say what's right. There isn't a single company out there that can use money or financial incentive to get me to say something either positive or negative about them or someone else. I say what I say freely in my mind because money isn't part of the calculus. I am free. I mean, I'm mission driven and values driven. It was the same thing back then.
if you were dependent upon that paycheck, then you would have kept your mouth shut.
Correct. Like when I was at Cargill, I was dependent upon that paycheck. But by the time I left once I was done at Cargill at the end of my career, I had saved up the 1 year's salary. So, you know, and we may do something like, what did I do to become financially free? I might do that too, you know, at some point. What was the approach? You know, a lot of people try to do 3 months salary, 6 months. I wanted a year. I started with a year. I started paying my bills this month with money I made 12 months ago. You know, that was my first goal, and then just kept going, you know. Anyway, my point is that being a change agent, you know, when they say when you burst through the glass ceiling, you're going to get cut up. It's true. The change agent, you have got to be willing to make enemies. And the thing that you should care about is whether or not you're right. Are you right? Yeah. Not popular. Hey, listen, I got to drop. I've got the executive meeting.